An innocent father is dragged away in handcuffs, his 12-year-old daughter clinging to him, begging them to stop. He swears he didn't do it, but the court doesn't care. Sentenced to life for a crime he never committed, his daughter is left abandoned in a world that now sees him as a murderer. But what happens next is unbelievable. Armed with nothing but a notebook and sheer determination, she fights to prove his innocence. Alone. But as she gets closer to the truth, a key witness vanishes, and powerful forces try to silence her. Can she survive long enough to expose the truth? Stay with us, because this fight for justice will leave you speechless. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening light painted golden streaks across the kitchen table, where Claire sat hunched over her math homework. Her pencil tapped against the textbook as she stared at a particularly tricky problem about fractions. The warm glow from the overhead lamp cast a cozy atmosphere throughout the room, making the family photos on the walls shine like treasured memories frozen in time. In one photo, Claire and her father grinned at the camera during last summer's camping trip, their faces speckled with ice cream. "I just don't get it, Dad," Claire sighed, tugging at her unruly ponytail in frustration. "These numbers don't make any sense. It's like they're dancing around in my head." James Walker leaned closer, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he pointed to the problem. The sleeve of his well-worn flannel shirt brushed against her arm as he moved. "Let's break it down into smaller pieces, sweetheart. Sometimes the biggest problems become clearer when we take them step by step." Claire couldn't help but smile at her father's patient tone. He always knew how to make things better, whether it was a scraped knee or a troublesome math equation. The familiar scent of his coffee mingled with the lingering aroma of the lasagna they'd had for dinner, creating that special evening comfort that only home could provide. "See here." James drew a simple diagram on her notebook, his steady hand creating neat lines. "Think of it like sharing a pizza. If you have 3/4 of a pizza and need to divide it." Claire's face lit up as understanding dawned, her eyes widening with excitement. "Oh, I get it now!" She quickly scribbled down the solution, her confidence growing with each number she wrote. The pencil flew across the paper as the math finally made sense. James chuckled warmly, ruffling her hair. "What did I tell you? You're smarter than you give yourself credit for. You just needed to look at it differently." Their quiet laughter filled the kitchen, making it feel like the safest place in the world. The clock on the wall ticked peacefully, marking another precious moment between father and daughter. Claire was about to tackle the next problem when a thunderous knock shattered their peaceful evening. Bang, bang, bang! The sound echoed through the house like gunshots, making both of them jump. Before either of them could react, the front door crashed open with a splintering sound that sent splinters of wood skittering across the floor. 2 police officers burst into their home, their heavy boots echoing against the hardwood floor. The sudden intrusion sent a family photo tumbling from its hook, the frame cracking as it hit the ground. "James Walker!" the older officer barked, his stern face set like stone. His hand rested menacingly on his holstered weapon. "Put your hands behind your back." Claire's pencil clattered to the floor as she watched her father slowly rise from his chair, his face a mask of confusion. The wooden chair scraped against the linoleum, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. "There must be some mistake," he said calmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "No mistake," Officer Harris growled, while his younger partner, Officer Briggs, shifted nervously behind him, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. "You're under arrest." The world seemed to move in slow motion as the officers roughly grabbed James, spinning him around to slap handcuffs on his wrists. The metal clicked shut with a sound that made Claire's stomach lurch, the harsh fluorescent light from outside glinting off the steel. "Dad!" she cried out, jumping from her chair so quickly it toppled backward. Her heart pounded so hard she could barely hear her own voice over the rushing in her ears. "What's happening? Dad!" She lunged forward, grabbing her father's arm. The fabric of his sleeve felt warm and familiar under her fingers, still carrying the warmth of their peaceful evening. But the officers were already pulling him away. "Please, stop! He didn't do anything wrong. You can't take him." "Claire, it's going to be okay," James called over his shoulder, trying to sound brave despite the fear in his eyes. His glasses had been knocked askew in the struggle, but he kept his gaze fixed on his daughter. "Everything will be all right, sweetheart. I promise." Through her tears, Claire caught glimpses of faces in the windows across the street, neighbors peering out from behind their curtains, their expressions a mix of shock and morbid curiosity. The Hendersons next door stood on their porch in their pajamas, whispering to each other. She could almost hear their whispers starting already, like poison spreading through the neighborhood. The officers dragged her father out the door, ignoring her desperate pleas. Claire followed them onto the porch, her bare feet cold against the wooden boards. The autumn night air bit at her skin as she watched helplessly as they pushed her father into the back of their police car. The red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the familiar street, transforming it into something alien and threatening. Standing alone in the doorway, Claire felt the evening chill seep into her bones. She stumbled back inside, her legs barely holding her up. The living room, so warm and safe just moments ago, now felt vast and empty, like all the joy had been sucked out of it. Her trembling hands found her father's jacket, which had fallen from the coat rack in the chaos. She clutched it close, breathing in his familiar scent, a mixture of aftershave and fresh laundry, as tears streamed down her face. The distant sound of police sirens faded into the night, taking her father with them. Claire stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind spinning with questions she couldn't answer. What had just happened? Why had they taken her father? The weight of fear pressed down on her chest as the reality of the situation began to sink in. On the kitchen table, her math homework lay forgotten, the half-solved problems now seeming impossibly trivial compared to the nightmare unfolding around her. Claire sat rigidly in the hard wooden bench of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. The room felt enormous and cold, with its towering ceiling and stern-faced people filling every seat. Her eyes kept darting to her father, who sat at the defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit, his shoulders straight despite the heavy chains around his wrists. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. The past month had been a blur of confusion and tears. She'd been staying with her Aunt Sarah, but sleep rarely came easy. Every night she'd stare at her ceiling, remembering the last moment she'd seen her father in their kitchen, helping her with math homework. The memory of his patient voice explaining fractions felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Now here she was, watching strangers decide his fate. Judge Reynolds, a gray-haired woman with sharp features, called the court to order. The sound of her gavel made Claire jump, the sharp crack echoing through the hushed room. The prosecutor, Mark Fields, rose from his seat with fluid confidence. His expensive suit seemed to gleam under the fluorescent lights as he approached the jury, each step measured and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fields began, his voice smooth as silk but dripping with venom. "The evidence we present today will prove, beyond any doubt, that James Walker is responsible for the brutal murder of Richard Thompson, a respected businessman and pillar of our community." His words hung in the air like poison. Claire's stomach churned. She wanted to stand up and scream that it wasn't true, that her father couldn't hurt anyone. But her aunt's gentle hand on her shoulder kept her seated, the touch both comforting and restraining. Fields continued his performance, gesturing dramatically as he spun his web of lies. His perfectly manicured hands cut through the air as he spoke. Mr. Walker carefully planned this murder, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The evidence will show premeditation, calculation, and a complete disregard for human life. When Sam Pearson, her father's court-appointed lawyer, stood to deliver his opening statement, Claire's hope quickly turned to despair. The elderly man's voice quavered as he spoke, his thin frame nearly drowning in his wrinkled suit. His hands trembled as he gripped the podium. "The defense will, show that the prosecution's case is circumstantial at best." He paused, shuffling through his messy papers, dropping several on the floor. The sound of papers scattering seemed to echo Claire's crumbling hopes. As the trial progressed, Claire watched in horror as Fields presented his evidence. A parade of witnesses she'd never seen before testified about things that couldn't be true. They described her father as a monster, a calculating killer who had stalked his victim for weeks. Claire knew these were lies. Her father had been with her those nights, reading bedtime stories or helping with homework. She could still recall the silly voices he used when reading her favorite books. The forensic evidence made her head spin. Fields displayed photographs and documents that seemed official but felt wrong. Her father's fingerprints supposedly found at the scene, security camera footage that was too blurry to really show anything, and a murder weapon that supposedly had her father's DNA. Each piece of evidence felt like another weight pressing down on her chest. Through it all, James Walker sat quietly, his face a mask of calm despite the storm of false accusations. But Claire could see the pain in his eyes, the slight trembling of his hands when particularly vicious lies were told about him. Occasionally, he would glance her way, trying to offer a reassuring smile that never quite reached his eyes. Sam Pearson's cross-examinations were weak and ineffective. He seemed overwhelmed by Fields's aggressive objections and the judge's stern warnings. Several times he appeared to forget his questions mid-sentence, leaving long, awkward silences in the courtroom. His fumbling attempts at defense felt like watching someone try to fight a lion with a wet newspaper. The jury barely took 2 hours to reach their verdict. When they filed back in, their faces were grim and determined. Claire's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe, her fingernails digging crescents into her palms. The forewoman stood, her voice clear and decisive. "We find the defendant, James Walker, guilty of first-degree murder." The judge's words that followed seemed to come from far away, as if Claire were underwater. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "No, please!" Claire's scream echoed through the courtroom. She lunged forward, trying to reach her father, but her aunt's arms held her back. James turned to look at her one last time, managing a small, tearful smile that broke her heart. A single tear rolled down his cheek as the guards led him away, the heavy doors closing behind him with a final, devastating thud. Claire slumped in her seat, her world crumbling around her. The courtroom continued to buzz with activity, but she couldn't hear anything over the roaring in her ears. People moved around her like shadows, their voices muffled and distant. Her father was gone, taken away by a system that hadn't even given him a chance. The taste of injustice was bitter in her mouth, and she knew with crushing certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled her favorite sweater from the dresser drawer. The soft blue fabric, the one her dad had given her for her last birthday, felt like a precious memory she couldn't bear to leave behind. She pressed it to her face, inhaling deeply, trying to catch any lingering trace of home. Her bedroom, usually a safe place filled with warmth and comfort, now felt strange and empty. Yellow police tape fluttered outside her window, a constant reminder of how everything had changed overnight. She could hear heavy boots on the front porch, another police officer doing their rounds. Their shadows passed beneath her door like dark ghosts. Claire quickly stuffed the sweater into her worn brown suitcase, trying to ignore the tears that kept threatening to fall. The house felt so different without her dad's gentle laugh or the smell of his famous pancakes on Sunday mornings. Even the sunlight streaming through her curtains seemed dimmer somehow. "Hurry up!" Aunt Lydia's sharp voice cut through the silence like a knife. "We don't have all day. The social worker is waiting." Claire grabbed her teddy bear from her bed, hugging it close before adding it to the suitcase. Its fuzzy ear was worn from years of comfort-seeking. She hadn't heard from her mom in weeks. Not since before everything happened. Now she was being sent away, and her whole world felt like it was crumbling beneath her feet. The drive to Aunt Lydia's house was long and silent, broken only by the occasional sigh from her aunt. Claire watched her neighborhood disappear through the car window, each familiar street sign feeling like another goodbye. Her forehead pressed against the cool glass as houses and trees blurred past. When they finally arrived, Aunt Lydia's house loomed before them, a gray two-story building that seemed as unwelcoming as its owner, with shutters hanging crooked and dead flowers in the window boxes. "This is your home now," Aunt Lydia said flatly, unlocking the front door. The hinges creaked in protest. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. And Claire?" She turned, her face hard and cold, lips pressed into a thin line. "Your father is a murderer. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be." Claire's chest tightened, her heart pounding against her ribs. "He's not. He would never." "Enough!" Aunt Lydia's voice cracked like a whip. Her eyes flashed with anger. "Your father is a murderer, Claire. You need to forget him and move on with your life." She pointed toward the stairs, her finger trembling slightly. "Now go unpack." Claire trudged up the stairs, her suitcase bumping against each step with a hollow thud. The room was small and plain, with faded wallpaper peeling at the corners and a narrow bed with a thin mattress. It felt nothing like home. As she sat on the bed, the springs squeaking beneath her weight, she could hear Aunt Lydia moving around downstairs, muttering to herself about that man and what a mess. Later that night, when the house was quiet except for the tick of an old grandfather clock, Claire crept out of her room. She'd noticed a pull-down ladder to the attic earlier, and something told her to investigate. The old wooden steps creaked as she climbed up, her flashlight beam dancing across dusty boxes and old furniture draped in yellowed sheets. The musty air made her nose itch. In the corner, she spotted a cardboard box labeled James in faded black marker. Her heart skipped a beat as she pulled it closer, dust motes swirling in her flashlight beam. Inside, she found old photographs of her dad in college, his young face smiling up at her, letters he'd written years ago in his familiar handwriting, and, most importantly, a stack of papers related to his case. Claire's hands shook as she began reading through the documents, her flashlight illuminating each page. Something caught her eye. Dates that didn't match up, witness statements that contradicted each other. She felt her heart racing as she realized what she was looking at. These weren't just old papers. They were clues that might help prove her father's innocence. For the first time since that terrible day, she felt a spark of hope flutter in her chest. The morning light filtered through the dusty attic window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floorboards. Claire sat cross-legged in her pink polka dot pajamas, surrounded by stacks of papers that formed a protective circle around her like a paper fortress. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red and burning from hours of reading in the dim light. A thin layer of dust coated everything in the cramped space, dancing in the early sunbeams. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered to herself, spreading out the court documents in front of her with trembling fingers. Her finger traced along the lines of text, stopping at crucial points that made her stomach twist with confusion and growing anger. There were witness statements that had never been mentioned during the trial, photographs that seemed to directly contradict what the prosecutor had claimed, and legal documents with dates that didn't match up. Each discovery made her heart beat faster with a mixture of hope and frustration. Claire pulled out her notebook, the spiral-bound one she'd started keeping since her father's arrest, its pages now dog-eared and filled with her careful observations. On a fresh page, she began listing the inconsistencies in her neat handwriting. Security camera footage from across the street, never shown in court. Statement from night guard, missing. Time of death different in police report and medical report. The list grew longer with each passing minute, confirming her suspicions that something was terribly wrong with her father's case. A creaking floorboard made her freeze mid-sentence. Through the thin ceiling, she could hear Aunt Lydia's footsteps in the room below, the familiar pattern of her pacing. Claire held her breath, not daring to move a muscle. The footsteps stopped, and then came the sound of a phone ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet. "Hello?" Aunt Lydia's voice carried through the floor. Claire carefully lay down on her stomach, pressing her ear against the wooden boards, ignoring the dust that clung to her pajamas. "Yes, I understand the situation," Lydia continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely reached Claire's straining ears. Claire listened intently, her heart pounding so loud she worried it might give her away. The blood rushed in her ears as Aunt Lydia's next words made her blood run cold, sending a shiver down her spine. "Peter Lawson," Lydia said in a hushed tone that carried a note of fear. "The witness who vanished. If he talks, everything could be ruined." There was a pause, followed by nervous pacing, each step making the floorboards creak anxiously. "I know what's at stake. Don't worry, I'll handle it." The threat in those final words was unmistakable. Claire's hands shook as she scrambled for her notebook, nearly knocking over a stack of papers in her haste. She wrote down the name in large letters, Peter Lawson. Underneath, she added, "Missing witness, knows something important." Her pencil pressed so hard into the paper that the letters left indentations on the next page. Her mind raced with questions, each one more urgent than the last. Who was Peter Lawson? What did he know about her father's case? And why was Aunt Lydia involved? The woman who had been telling her to forget about her father's case, to move on with her life, clearly knew more than she was letting on. The realization made Claire's chest tight with betrayal. Claire flipped through the court documents again, searching frantically for any mention of Peter Lawson. Nothing. His name wasn't in any of the witness lists or police reports. It was as if he had been completely erased from the case, wiped away like footprints in the sand. She pulled out a fresh page in her notebook and wrote at the top, "Find Peter Lawson." Below it, she started listing possible ways to track him down, her mind working overtime. The local phone book, the library's newspaper archives, maybe even the internet at the public library, where Aunt Lydia couldn't monitor her searches. Each option gave her a small spark of hope. The sound of Aunt Lydia's footsteps moving toward the stairs made Claire quickly gather her papers, her heart racing. She stuffed them back into the box, careful to arrange everything exactly as she'd found it, making sure no trace of her investigation remained. Her notebook she tucked safely into the waistband of her pajama pants, hidden under her loose t-shirt, the pages warm against her skin. As she heard Aunt Lydia's footsteps fade away downstairs, Claire looked at the name she'd written down, her eyes narrowing with determination. Peter Lawson. Somewhere out there, this man held the key to proving her father's innocence. She would find him, no matter what it took. The weight of her notebook against her side felt like a promise to her father and to herself. The next morning, Claire picked at her scrambled eggs, barely tasting them as Aunt Lydia's stern gaze bore into her from across the kitchen table. The ticking of the old wall clock seemed extra loud in the uncomfortable silence. A half-eaten piece of toast grew cold on her plate, while the morning sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows on the worn tablecloth. "Finish your breakfast," Aunt Lydia said sharply, drumming her fingers against her coffee mug. "And don't forget to clean your room today. It's been a mess all week." Claire nodded, her mind already racing with plans. She forced down another tasteless bite of eggs to avoid suspicion. As soon as Aunt Lydia turned to wash the dishes, the familiar clink of porcelain filling the kitchen, Claire grabbed her backpack and slipped out the front door. The morning air was crisp, and her sneakers made soft sounds against the sidewalk as she walked quickly toward the library, fallen leaves crunching beneath her feet. The familiar brick building came into view, its wide steps leading up to heavy wooden doors. Pigeons scattered as she climbed the steps, their wings fluttering in the morning quiet. Inside, The library was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of turning pages. The smell of old books and wooden shelves filled her nose as she made her way to the research section, passing rows of carefully organized volumes. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly librarian with wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan that matched the autumn leaves outside, gave Claire a warm smile. "Good morning, dear. School project?" "Something like that," Claire mumbled, hurrying past, her cheeks flushing at the small deception. In the reference section, Claire pulled out a heavy phone book, its pages yellow with age and crinkled at the corners from years of use. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages, the paper rough against her skin. "Lawson? Lawson?" she whispered to herself, running her finger down each column, her heart beating faster with each page turn. After what felt like hours of searching through dusty records and old newspaper clippings that left smudges on her fingers, Claire's heart leapt. There it was. Peter Lawson, with an address listed at the Pinewood Apartments on the edge of town. She quickly copied down the information in her notebook, her handwriting messy with excitement, the pencil nearly slipping from her grip. Claire rushed to the payphone in the library's entrance hall, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. She dropped in her quarters with shaking hands, the coins making a metallic clinking sound as they fell. She dialed the number, holding her breath and twisting the phone cord around her finger. But instead of a ring, she heard only a recorded message. "We're sorry, but the number you have dialed has been disconnected." Her shoulders slumped as disappointment washed over her, the receiver feeling suddenly heavy in her hand. She'd been so close. Claire leaned against the wall, clutching her notebook until the spiral binding left marks on her palm. The phone number was a dead end, but she still had the address. Maybe Peter Lawson still lived there, even if his phone was disconnected. Her mind raced with possibilities and potential risks. Looking down at the address scribbled in her notebook, Claire made a decision, her jaw set with determination. If she couldn't reach Peter Lawson by phone, she would have to find him in person. It wasn't the safest plan, but what choice did she have? Her father was counting on her, even if he didn't know it. The thought of him sitting alone in his cell gave her courage. She carefully tore the page from her notebook and folded it, tucking it into her jacket pocket where it pressed against her side like a secret. The weight of it felt like both a burden and a promise. This could be the key to proving her father's innocence, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Her fingers brushed against the paper through the fabric, making sure it was secure. The library had grown quieter, if that was possible, with only the distant sound of turning pages and soft footsteps breaking the silence. Claire knew she needed to head home before Aunt Lydia got suspicious and started asking questions she couldn't answer. But now she had a real lead, something concrete to follow. The hunt for Peter Lawson would have to wait until she could figure out how to get to Pinewood Apartments. But at least now she had a destination and a plan forming in her mind. As she pushed open the heavy library doors, feeling the cool brass handle beneath her palm, Claire felt different than when she'd entered. She wasn't just a girl with a desperate hope anymore. She was an investigator with a real clue to follow. The morning sun felt warmer now, more encouraging. Peter Lawson was out there somewhere, and she was going to find him, no matter what it took. The evening air grew chilly as Claire climbed aboard the city bus, her heart thumping against her ribs. She clutched her backpack tightly, watching unfamiliar streets roll past the window. The bus lights flickered, casting strange shadows across her worried face. A few other passengers dozed in their seats, oblivious to her nervous energy. "Pine Street coming up," the bus driver called out in a tired voice, stifling a yawn. Claire's stomach did a flip as she pulled the cord to request her stop. The bus wheezed to a halt with a squeal of brakes, and she stepped down onto cracked pavement dotted with weeds. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light that didn't quite reach the dark spaces between buildings, where shadows seemed to shift and move. Taking a deep breath, Claire walked down the quiet street, checking house numbers as she went. The sound of her footsteps seemed too loud in the empty neighborhood, echoing off the weathered buildings. A cat darted across her path, making her jump, its yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness before it vanished. Finally, she stood before the Pinewood Apartments. The building looked sad and tired, with paint peeling off like old sunburned skin. A broken security light buzzed and blinked near the entrance, creating an eerie dance of shadows. Claire's hands felt sweaty as she approached the first apartment door, her fingers trembling slightly as she double-checked the apartment number. She raised her fist and knocked 3 times, the sound echoing in the quiet courtyard. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard shuffling inside, the sound of a chain being removed, and the door creaked open on rusty hinges. A man with messy brown hair and several days' worth of stubble peered out at her. His eyes, bloodshot and wary, widened in surprise when he saw Claire standing there. The smell of stale coffee wafted through the doorway. "Mr. Lawson?" Claire's voice came out smaller than she meant it to, barely above a whisper. "I'm Claire Walker, James Walker's daughter." Peter Lawson's face went pale, the color draining away like water down a drain. He glanced nervously over her shoulder, scanning the darkness behind her before opening the door wider. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But come in quickly." The apartment was small and cluttered, with newspapers covering most surfaces like a paper jungle. Empty coffee cups littered the coffee table, some with dried rings beneath them, and the curtains were drawn tight against the outside world. A small desk lamp provided the only illumination, casting long shadows on the walls. "Please," Claire said, sitting on the edge of his worn couch, which creaked under her weight. "I need to know the truth about my dad." Peter ran a hand through his disheveled hair, pacing back and forth on the threadbare carpet. "Your father, he's innocent," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "I saw everything that night. The real killer. He's someone with power, someone who can make people disappear, someone who's been haunting my nightmares." Claire leaned forward, her heart racing like a drum. "Will you help us? Will you testify?" Peter stopped pacing and looked at her with tired eyes, dark circles beneath them telling stories of sleepless nights. "I've been hiding for months because I know too much. But..." He sat down heavily in an armchair that had seen better days. "If you can guarantee my safety, I'll tell everything I know. Your father doesn't deserve to be in prison. Not for a single day more." Relief flooded through Claire's body like warm sunshine. Finally, someone who could help prove her father's innocence. Someone brave enough to speak the truth. As she left the apartment, hope made her steps lighter. The street seemed less scary now that she had an ally. But as she walked toward the bus stop, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something felt wrong. She couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching her from the shadows, following her every move. The darkness between the buildings seemed to hold secrets, and not all of them friendly. Claire burst through the front door of Aunt Lydia's house, her heart pounding with excitement. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet, highlighting the swirling dust motes in the air. "Aunt Lydia! I found him! I found Peter Lawson!" she exclaimed, her words tumbling out in a breathless rush, her cheeks flushed with triumph. Aunt Lydia appeared in the hallway, her face tight with concern, her thin fingers clutching the fabric of her faded house dress. She wore her usual stern expression, but something else flickered in her eyes. Was it fear? Her shoulders tensed visibly as she stood in the shadowy hallway. Before Claire could explain further, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out, expecting good news from Peter. Instead, the message made her blood run cold. "Peter Lawson missing from apartment, door broken, police investigating." The words seemed to blur and dance before her eyes. The phone nearly slipped from Claire's shaking fingers. Her excitement evaporated, replaced by a heavy dread that settled in her stomach like lead. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. This can't be happening. The morning sunshine suddenly felt harsh and mocking. Without waiting for Aunt Lydia's response, Claire ran out the door and headed straight for the police station. The morning air felt thick and oppressive as she hurried down the sidewalk, her sneakers slapping against the concrete, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities. What had happened to Peter? Was he okay? Had someone hurt him because of what he knew? At the police station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Claire approached the front desk, their harsh glare making everything look sickly and unreal. The officer on duty, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and coffee stains on his uniform, barely looked up from his computer screen. "Excuse me," Claire said, her voice wavering like a leaf in the wind. "I need to report something about Peter Lawson's disappearance." Her fingers drummed nervously on the high counter. The officer's expression remained blank, his face a mask of indifference. "The missing person from Oak Street." "Yes. I talked to him yesterday. He had important information about my father's case. Someone must have..." Her words came faster and faster, desperate to make him understand. "Listen, kid." The officer cut her off, his voice cold and dismissive, like he was shooing away an annoying fly. "Missing persons reports take time. There's nothing we can do right now." "But you don't understand," Claire protested, her voice rising with desperation. "This isn't just any disappearance. He was going to help prove my father's innocence." She could feel hot tears threatening to spill over. The officer sighed heavily, the sound full of impatience. "Go home. Let the adults handle this." He turned back to his computer, effectively dismissing her. Fighting back tears of frustration, Claire left the station, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her with a final sounding thud. The walk back to Aunt Lydia's house felt longer than ever, each step heavier than the last. When she finally arrived, her aunt was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her mouth set in a hard line. "What were you thinking?" Aunt Lydia demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Getting involved with strangers, putting yourself in danger?" Her fingers tapped an angry rhythm against her arm. "Peter wasn't dangerous," Claire argued, her chin lifting defiantly. "He was trying to help." "Enough!" Aunt Lydia's voice cracked like a whip in the tense kitchen air. "You're going to your room and you're staying there. I won't have you mixed up in this nonsense anymore." Her face had gone pale with anger. "But Aunt Lydia..." "No buts!" Her aunt grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly, her fingers trembling slightly as she marched her upstairs. "This is for your own good." The stairs creaked ominously under their feet. Claire heard the lock click behind her as Aunt Lydia shut the door, the sound echoing with horrible finality. She ran to the window, pressing her hands against the cool glass, leaving small, foggy prints. Somewhere out there, Peter Lawson was missing, perhaps because he'd tried to help her. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her shoulders as she stared out at the quiet street below, watching a few dry leaves skitter across the sidewalk. The room felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in around her like a trap. Claire's mind wouldn't stop racing, playing out terrible scenarios one after another. Someone had taken Peter, someone who didn't want the truth about her father to come out. And now she was trapped here, unable to help either of them, watching helplessly as her chances for justice slipped away. She slumped down on her bed, the springs creaking beneath her weight, the sound somehow lonely in the quiet room. The truth about her father's case was slipping away, just when she'd been so close to grasping it. Peter was gone, and she was locked in this room, powerless to do anything about it. The afternoon shadows lengthened across her floor, marking time's steady march forward while she sat, trapped and alone with her fears. Claire sat at her small desk early the next morning, sunlight barely peeking through her faded blue curtains. Her heart felt heavy, but determined as she smoothed out a clean sheet of paper, running her fingers over its crisp surface. The wooden chair creaked as she adjusted her position, its familiar sound echoing in the quiet room. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she gripped her favorite ballpoint pen. "Dear Judge Reynolds," she began, her normally steady hand trembling slightly as she formed each letter with care. Claire paused, gathering her thoughts while staring at the 2 words she'd written. How could she possibly explain everything in just one letter? All the sleepless nights, the worried looks, the empty chair at dinner. It seemed impossible to capture it all, but she had to try. "My name is Claire Walker. You might remember me from my father James Walker's trial." She pressed the pen harder against the paper, willing her words to carry the weight of truth, leaving deep indentations on the page. "I know there's new evidence that wasn't shown in court. A witness named Peter Lawson came forward and told me my father was framed." Her stomach twisted as she wrote Mr. Lawson's name. Claire's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly, tilting her head back slightly. She couldn't let her emotions smudge the ink. This letter was too important. "Mr. Lawson told me everything. He saw what really happened that night, and it wasn't my father. But now Mr. Lawson has disappeared, and I'm scared something bad has happened to him." Her hand shook as she wrote about his disappearance. The morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across her desk as Claire continued writing, pouring her heart onto the page. She described her father's kindness, his dedication to helping others, and how he'd always taught her to stand up for the truth. Her hand cramped from gripping the pen so tightly, but she kept going, determined to make every word count. "Please, Judge Reynolds, my father deserves another chance. The evidence wasn't right. Someone powerful wanted to hurt him, and they made sure the trial wasn't fair. I'm just asking for you to look at the case again. That's all I want, for the truth to come out." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Claire signed her name at the bottom, then carefully folded the letter with trembling fingers and slipped it into a crisp white envelope. She addressed it to the courthouse in her neatest handwriting, making sure each letter was perfectly clear and legible. This letter had to reach Judge Reynolds. It just had to. Everything depended on it. Aunt Lydia's footsteps echoed downstairs as she moved around the kitchen, the sound of cabinets opening and closing drifting up. Claire knew she had to act fast. She tucked the envelope into her jacket pocket, feeling its weight against her side, and quietly opened her door, wincing at the slight squeak of the hinges. The stairs posed a challenge. The 3rd step always creaked loudly enough to wake the dead. Claire carefully stepped over it, holding her breath and keeping close to the wall where the wood was most stable. She could hear Aunt Lydia humming an old tune in the kitchen, the rich smell of coffee drifting through the house like a morning fog. Claire's heart pounded against her ribs as she crept toward the front door, her sock-covered feet silent on the wooden floor. The brass handle felt cold under her fingers as she turned it slowly, praying it wouldn't make a sound. A rush of cool morning air hit her face as she slipped outside into the gray dawn light. The walk to the mailbox felt longer than usual, each step heavy with purpose. Every car that passed made Claire jump, her shoulders tensing as she wondered if someone was watching her. The red mailbox stood on the corner like a sentinel, its metal surface dulled by years of sun and rain, waiting for her letter. Claire's fingers trembled as she held the envelope one last time, feeling the weight of her words, her hopes, her father's future. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the morning stillness. "Please let this work." She opened the mailbox slot and watched as the letter disappeared inside with a soft thump that seemed to echo her heartbeat. Standing there in the strengthening morning light, Claire felt oddly peaceful, despite the enormity of what she'd just done. She'd done everything she could think of to help her father, poured her whole heart into those pages. Now all she could do was wait and hope that Judge Reynolds would read her words and understand the truth she'd tried so hard to share, the truth that burned in her heart like a steady flame. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen table where Claire sat, her breakfast untouched. Her eyes remained fixed on the front door, watching and waiting. Every time a car passed by, She jumped slightly, wondering if it was the mail truck. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet kitchen. Aunt Lydia had already left for work, leaving Claire alone with her thoughts and racing heart. She drummed her fingers nervously on the wooden table, the steady rhythm matching her pulse. Finally, the familiar sound of the mail truck's brakes squealing made Claire bolt upright. She rushed to the window, watching as the mailman stuffed several envelopes into their mailbox. Her hands trembled as she waited for him to drive away before darting outside. The metal mailbox felt cool against her fingers as she pulled it open. There, among the bills and advertisements, was an official-looking envelope addressed to her. Claire's throat went dry as she stared at the courthouse seal in the corner. Back inside, she sat at the kitchen table, the envelope feeling heavy in her hands. Taking a deep breath, she carefully tore it open and unfolded the crisp paper inside. "Dear Miss Walker," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. As her eyes scanned the formal language, her heart sank deeper and deeper. Words jumped out at her. Insufficient evidence. No grounds for retrial. Matter considered closed. Judge Reynolds had rejected her plea completely. He didn't believe her about Peter Lawson or any of the evidence she'd found. The letter felt like it was burning in her hands as tears welled up in her eyes. Claire let the paper fall to the table, her vision blurring. All her hard work, all her hope, crushed by a few paragraphs of cold legal language. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a shaky breath. For several minutes, she sat there, feeling the weight of defeat press down on her shoulders. The kitchen clock continued its steady ticking, marking each moment of her despair. But as she wiped her eyes and looked again at the letter, something inside her shifted. Number. She wouldn't let this be the end. Her father was innocent, and she knew it in her bones. If Judge Reynolds wouldn't listen, she'd find someone who would. Claire straightened up in her chair, squaring her shoulders. The legal system had failed her father, but there were other ways to fight. People needed to know the truth about what happened. They needed to hear her father's story. She pulled her notebook closer, flipping to a clean page. If the courts wouldn't help, she'd take her case straight to the public. Someone out there would listen. Someone would care enough to help. Her pen moved across the paper as she began making plans. She'd tell everyone who would listen about her father's innocence, about Peter Lawson's disappearance, about all the evidence that was ignored. The truth couldn't stay buried forever, not if she had anything to say about it. The rejection letter lay forgotten on the table as Claire wrote, her determination growing with each word. She wasn't just a little girl anymore. She was her father's voice, and she would make sure the world heard it. Claire sat at the kitchen table, her fingers hovering over the laptop keyboard. The judge's rejection letter lay crumpled beside her, but instead of crushing her spirit, it had sparked something new. She took a deep breath and began typing. "Dear Editor," she wrote, her words flowing faster as the story poured out. "My father, James Walker, was wrongfully convicted of murder last month. The evidence was fabricated, witnesses were silenced, and an innocent man sits in prison while the real criminals walk free." She described everything: the sudden arrest, the unfair trial, and Peter Lawson's disappearance. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed, but her determination never wavered. After finishing the first letter, she started another, and another. The kitchen grew dim as afternoon turned to evening. Claire's back ached from hunching over the laptop, but she kept going. She researched newspaper contacts, made lists of journalists, and crafted personalized messages for each one. Some tears fell on the keyboard as she wrote, but she wiped them away quickly. Days turned into weeks. Claire developed a routine: wake up early, check her email, make more calls. She'd sit in her room during lunch breaks at school, leaving voicemails for reporters. "Please," she'd say into the phone, trying to sound older than her 12 years. "This is important. Someone needs to hear this story." But nobody responded. Her inbox remained empty, except for polite automated replies. The silence felt deafening. One particularly tough morning, Claire sat on her bed, staring at her phone. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was just a kid who couldn't change anything. Her finger hovered over the delete button for her draft emails folder. Then the phone rang. Claire almost dropped it in surprise. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. "Hello, is this Claire Walker?" a deep, friendly voice asked. "Yes, this is she," Claire replied, sitting up straighter. "This is Daniel Rains from the Daily Chronicle. I received your letter about your father's case." Claire's heart stopped for a moment. You did?" "I did," Daniel confirmed. "And I have to say, what you've written is very compelling. I'd like to meet with you to discuss this further." Claire's hands shook as she gripped the phone tighter. "Really? You want to help?" "I want to hear the whole story," Daniel said carefully. "Would you be comfortable meeting somewhere public, maybe with your guardian present?" "Yes," Claire exclaimed, then lowered her voice. "Yes, I would like that very much." They arranged to meet at a local coffee shop the following day. As Claire hung up the phone, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Someone was finally going to listen. Someone was going to help her tell her father's story. Claire fidgeted with her coffee cup in the small cafe, her hands trembling slightly as she faced Daniel Rains. The journalist's kind eyes and relaxed demeanor helped calm her nerves. Sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow on the scattered papers between them. "Start from the beginning," Daniel said gently, pulling out his notebook. "Tell me everything." Claire took a deep breath. "It happened so fast. One minute I was doing homework with my dad, and the next, police were dragging him away." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward, determined to share every detail. Daniel listened intently, his pen moving steadily across the page. When Claire mentioned Peter Lawson's disappearance, he paused, looking up sharply. "And you spoke to him personally? Before he vanished?" "Yes," Claire nodded firmly. "He told me Dad was framed. He was scared, but he promised to help." She described her visit to Peter's apartment, the fear in his eyes, and his sudden disappearance. Over the following weeks, Daniel dove deep into the case. Claire would often find him at the courthouse, poring over dusty files and court transcripts. His desk at the newspaper office became cluttered with documents, sticky notes, and photographs connected to James's case. "Something's not adding up," Daniel muttered one afternoon, spreading out various witness statements. He'd called Claire to his office to review his findings. "These testimonies contradict each other, and the forensic evidence? It looks altered." Claire watched as Daniel made phone calls, interviewed former colleagues of the murdered businessman, and cross-referenced dates and times. His wall gradually filled with photos and documents connected by red string, like something from a detective movie. Then came the breakthrough. Daniel burst into the cafe where they usually met, his face flushed with excitement and concern. "Claire, I found something big." He lowered his voice, glancing around before continuing. "The real murderer. It's someone with serious connections. Someone who could make evidence disappear and witnesses vanish." Claire's heart raced as Daniel explained his discoveries. The truth was bigger and more frightening than she'd imagined. The person behind her father's framing wasn't just powerful. They were influential enough to manipulate the entire justice system. When Daniel's article finally went to print, it exploded across the city. Claire sat in front of the TV, watching as news anchors discussed the shocking revelations. Her father's case had become the biggest story in town, with Daniel's detailed exposé revealing the corruption that had led to James's wrongful conviction. Breaking news. Local man. Wrongfully convicted. Powerful figure. Implicated in cover-up. The headlines screamed. Social media buzzed with outrage as people shared Daniel's article, demanding justice for James Walker. Claire hugged the newspaper to her chest, tears of relief streaming down her face. Finally, people were listening. Finally, the truth was coming out. Claire's eyes fluttered open to the sound of the television downstairs. The morning sun was barely peeking through her curtains, but she could hear the news anchor's voice clearly. In a shocking development, new evidence suggests local businessman James Walker may have been wrongfully convicted. She bolted out of bed, her heart racing. Running downstairs in her pajamas, Claire stood transfixed in front of the TV. Daniel's article was everywhere. News channels were picking up the story, showing her father's photo and discussing the details of his case. Breaking news. Sources reveal potential cover-up in the Walker murder case. Scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, hardly daring to breathe. After months of fighting alone, the world was finally listening. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates and neighbors. Even Mrs. Peterson from across the street, who had watched her father's arrest that terrible night, called to express her support. "I always knew your father couldn't have done it," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was too good a man." Throughout the morning, Claire watched as legal experts on TV dissected her father's case. They pointed out the flaws in the original trial, the missing evidence, and the suspicious disappearance of Peter Lawson. The powerful figure behind the murder, whose name was now being mentioned in hushed tones, faced mounting scrutiny. By afternoon, social media was ablaze with #Justice for James Walker. People shared Daniel's article thousands of times, demanding answers and accountability. Claire felt overwhelmed by the support, tears streaming down her face as she read comment after comment from strangers calling for her father's release. Then came the call that changed everything. "Claire?" Daniel's voice was excited. "The judge just announced he's granting a retrial. The public pressure worked." Claire sank to her knees, phone pressed to her ear. "Really? They're really giving Dad another chance?" "Yes," Daniel confirmed. "But Claire, listen. This isn't over. The same powerful people who put your father away are going to fight back hard. They won't give up easily." Claire nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, but now we have help. Now people know the truth." She hung up and walked to her window, looking out at the courthouse in the distance. Tomorrow she would stand there, ready to fight the next battle for her father's freedom. The thought both terrified and strengthened her. Aunt Lydia appeared in the doorway, her usual stern expression softened. "Claire, I was wrong about your father. I'm sorry I didn't believe you." Claire turned to face her aunt, seeing real regret in the older woman's eyes. She crossed the room and hugged her, both of them holding tight as the news continued to play in the background. Outside the house, reporters had begun to gather, hoping to speak with the young girl who had never given up on her father. Claire watched them from behind the curtains, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, for this moment, she allowed herself to feel the pure joy of this first victory. Standing in front of her mirror, Claire straightened her shoulders and practiced what she would say at the courthouse tomorrow. The retrial would be tough, but she was ready. She had fought too hard to back down now. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Claire settled into the hard wooden bench in the front row. Her sweaty palms pressed against her skirt as she tried to steady her breathing. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with spectators, journalists scribbling in their notepads, and curious onlookers who had followed the case in the news. James sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders straight despite the weight of his prison uniform. When he turned to look at Claire, their eyes met. His gentle smile carried the same warmth it had on homework nights, before everything changed. Claire's throat tightened, but she managed to smile back. Eleanor Brooks strode to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking purposefully against the floor. Her navy suit was crisp, her demeanor confident as she faced the jury. She was everything their previous lawyer wasn't: prepared, passionate, and unafraid. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Eleanor began, her voice clear and strong. "What you are about to hear is a story of injustice. A story of how an innocent man, James Walker, was convicted based on fabricated evidence and silenced witnesses." Claire watched as Eleanor methodically laid out their case. She pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in the original trial, and most importantly, the mysterious disappearance of Peter Lawson. A key witness was deliberately silenced, Eleanor declared. A man who could have testified to Mr. Walker's innocence vanished just when the truth was about to emerge. The prosecution team, led by Mark Fields, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. When they rose to counter Eleanor's arguments, their response was aggressive, but felt hollow. The defendant's guilt was proven beyond reasonable doubt in the original trial, Fields insisted, his voice sharp with frustration. Eleanor was ready for every argument. When Fields mentioned the supposed motive, she produced documents showing James had no connection to the victim's business dealings. When he spoke of circumstantial evidence, she revealed how each piece had been manipulated or taken out of context. Judge Reynolds leaned forward in his chair, his expression stern as he addressed both sides. "This court will proceed based on facts, not speculation," he warned. "Ms. Brooks, while your arguments are compelling, they must be supported by concrete evidence." Claire's hands trembled as she watched the legal battle unfold. Her father remained composed, taking notes and whispering occasionally to Eleanor. His calmness gave her strength, even as her stomach churned with anxiety. As the first day drew to a close, Claire watched the guards approach her father. James stood, his handcuffs clinking softly. Before being led away, he turned to Claire one last time. His eyes were bright with something she hadn't seen in months. Hope. Real, unmistakable hope. Claire pressed her hand against her heart, fighting back tears. For the first time since that terrible night when the police had burst through their door, she felt like the truth might actually win out. Eleanor's strong defense and her father's quiet dignity made her believe that maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. Claire sat rigid in her seat as Tom Randall took the witness stand. His weathered face was set in stern lines as he raised his right hand to be sworn in. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look even more severe. "Mr. Randall," the prosecutor began smoothly, "please tell us about your observations regarding James Walker and the victim." Randall cleared his throat. "Well, I was working security at the bank when Mr. Walker came in that day. He was agitated, demanding to see Mr. Thompson about a loan. When Thompson denied him, Walker lost it completely." Claire's fingers dug into her palms. She knew this was a lie. Her father had never even applied for a loan at that bank. The prosecutor continued leading Randall through his testimony, painting a picture of James as a desperate, violent man. "He was shouting, saying he'd make Thompson pay," Randall continued, his voice growing more confident. "I had to escort him out personally." Claire glanced at the jury. Several of them were nodding, buying into this fabricated story. Her stomach churned as she watched their faces grow increasingly concerned. But then Eleanor Brooks stood up, adjusting her blazer with practiced calm. "Mr. Randall," she began, her voice clear and measured, "you said you personally witnessed Mr. Walker's loan application being denied?" "That's right," Randall nodded firmly. "And what date was this?" "March 15th, 2022. Eleanor's lips curved slightly. "Interesting. I have here the complete records of all loan applications processed at First National Bank for the entire month of March 2022. She held up a thick folder. "Would it surprise you to learn that James Walker's name doesn't appear anywhere in these records?" Randall's face reddened. "Well, I'm certain I saw him there." "In fact," Eleanor continued, "Mr. Walker has never applied for a loan at First National Bank. Not in March, not ever. How do you explain that?" The witness shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe it was informal. A meeting." "Mr. Randall, isn't it true that you retired from First National Bank in February 2022, a full month before this alleged incident?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Claire watched as Randall's confident demeanor crumbled. The jury members exchanged glances, several of them frowning and shaking their heads. There must be some mistake in the records, Randall stammered. No mistake, Mr. Randall. I have your retirement party announcement right here. Eleanor held up another document. So I'll ask you directly, did you actually witness James Walker having any interaction with Mr. Thompson? Randall's shoulders slumped. No, he admitted quietly. I heard about it from someone else. Claire felt her heart soar as she watched the jury's reactions. The doubt was clear on their faces now. Eleanor had expertly exposed the first crack in the prosecution's case, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Sophie Bennett took the witness stand. Her navy blue blazer and perfectly styled hair gave her an air of authority that made Claire's stomach twist with anxiety. The prosecutor approached, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. Dr. Bennett, please state your credentials for the court, the prosecutor requested. I have a PhD in forensic science from Stanford University and have worked as a forensic analyst for the state crime lab for 12 years, Dr. Bennett replied, her voice clear and confident. Claire watched as the prosecutor guided Dr. Bennett through her testimony. The analyst pulled out enlarged photographs of the murder weapon, pointing to specific areas where James's fingerprints were allegedly found. These prints, Dr. Bennett explained, gesturing to the images, match James Walker's fingerprints with 99.9% certainty. The ridge patterns are identical in 12 distinct points. Claire's hands began to shake. She glanced at her father, who sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. How could his prints be on that gun? It didn't make sense. Eleanor Brooks stood up slowly, her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Bennett, when exactly were these prints analyzed? 3 days after the murder, Dr. Bennett answered promptly. And who had access to the evidence during those 3 days? Objection, Your Honor, the prosecutor interrupted. Relevance? I'm establishing the chain of custody, Eleanor explained. Overruled. The witness may answer. Dr. Bennett shifted slightly. The evidence was stored in our secure facility. Standard protocols were followed. Eleanor pressed further. Is it possible the evidence could have been compromised during those 3 days? Objection! The prosecutor's voice was sharp. Speculation. Sustained, the judge ruled firmly. Claire watched helplessly as Eleanor's attempts to challenge the evidence were repeatedly blocked. The jury members leaned forward, hanging on Dr. Bennett's every word about ridge patterns and probability statistics. When Eleanor finally sat down, her shoulders were tense. Claire could see the defeat in her posture, the way her hands clenched together on the table. Claire bowed her head and whispered a desperate prayer, her heart heavy with fear. The evidence seemed impossible to dispute, and she could feel their chances of winning slipping away with each passing moment. The sound of the judge's gavel made her jump. We'll take a 15-minute recess, he announced. Claire remained in her seat, watching as Dr. Bennett gathered her materials. The analyst's confident demeanor felt like a physical weight pressing down on Claire's chest, crushing her hope beneath the weight of scientific certainty. Claire sat across from Daniel in the quiet cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate she hadn't touched. The afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across their corner table. Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement as he reached into his messenger bag. I've got something, he said in a hushed voice, sliding a manila envelope across the wooden table. Claire's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside, she found several photographs and a detailed report typed on crisp white paper. Her heart began to race as she scanned the documents. I tracked down Peter Lawson's ex-wife, Mary, Daniel explained, leaning forward. She was scared to talk at first, but once I convinced her how important this was, she opened up. Claire looked up from the papers. What did she say? The night before Peter disappeared, Mary saw him arguing with someone outside their apartment. A man in an expensive suit was threatening him, telling him to keep his mouth shut about what he knew. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Mary said Peter came inside shaking. He told her everything, about witnessing the real murderer, about being forced to stay quiet. Claire's hands gripped the edge of the table. Did she identify the man? Not directly, but she described him as working for someone powerful, someone with connections to City Hall. Daniel pulled out another photograph, this one showing Mary Lawson, a thin woman with worried eyes and graying brown hair. Mary's been living in fear since Peter vanished. She almost didn't talk to me, but I think she's carried this guilt for too long. Claire spread the documents across the table, her mind racing. This was exactly what they needed, proof that Peter had been silenced, evidence of a cover-up reaching to the highest levels of power in the city. There's more, Daniel continued. Mary kept some of Peter's personal papers, notes he'd written about what he saw that night, names of people involved. He was building his own case, Claire. He wanted to come forward, but they got to him first. Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes. All this time, Peter had been trying to do the right thing, and it had cost him everything. She gathered the papers with shaking hands, carefully placing them back in the envelope. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered. "This could change everything." Daniel nodded solemnly. "Be careful with this information, Claire. The same people who threatened Peter are still out there." Claire clutched the envelope to her chest and stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. She had to get this information to Eleanor Brooks right away. Maybe this was the key to saving her father, to finally exposing the truth. As she hurried back toward the courthouse, the manila envelope felt heavy with possibility. Each step brought her closer to justice, closer to bringing her father home. The afternoon sun warmed her face as she walked, her determination growing with each step. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as Mary Lawson approached the witness stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her navy blue dress, and Claire could see the fear etched across her face. Eleanor Brooks stood confidently, her voice gentle but firm as she began questioning Mary. "Mrs. Lawson, could you tell us about the last conversation you had with your ex-husband, Peter?" Eleanor asked. Mary's voice quivered at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. "Peter came to my house late one night about 2 months ago. I'd never seen him so scared before. His hands were shaking, and he kept looking over his shoulder like someone was following him." Claire leaned forward in her seat, her heart pounding. She watched the jury members' faces, noting how they hung on every word. "He told me he couldn't live with the guilt anymore," Mary continued, wringing her hands. "He said he knew who really killed that businessman, but these powerful people had threatened him. They said if he ever told anyone the truth, they'd hurt our children." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while the judge leaned forward, his expression intense. "Did Peter mention specific details about these threats?" Eleanor asked. Mary nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "A man came to his workplace, tall, well-dressed. He told Peter that if he ever mentioned what he saw that night, he'd regret it. Peter said this man worked for someone important, someone with enough money and power to make people disappear." Eleanor paced slowly before the witness stand. "And what did Peter tell you about the night of the murder?" "He said he saw everything. He was working late at the office building across the street. He saw who really killed that businessman, and it wasn't James Walker." Mary's voice grew stronger with conviction. "Peter wanted to come forward during the trial, but they got to him first. They scared him into silence." Claire watched the jury members exchange meaningful glances. One woman in the front row frowned deeply, scribbling notes on her pad. Another juror shook his head slightly, his previous certainty clearly wavering. "Mrs. Lawson," Eleanor continued, "did Peter ever indicate who this powerful person might be?" "He was too scared to say the name," Mary replied, her voice catching. "But he said it was someone who could buy their way out of anything, someone who could make evidence disappear and fabricate new evidence when they needed it. The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation." "Overruled," the judge responded firmly. "The witness is recounting a direct conversation." Claire felt her heart soar as she watched the jury's reactions. For the first time since the trial began, she could see real doubt in their eyes. The prosecution's carefully constructed case was beginning to crumble under the weight of Mary's testimony. Eleanor continued her questioning, skillfully drawing out more details about Peter's fear and the threats he received. With each answer, Mary's testimony cast more doubt on the original conviction, creating cracks in the foundation of lies that had imprisoned James Walker. As Eleanor finished her questioning, Claire caught her father's eye. For the first time in months, she saw something there that made her heart leap. Hope. Robert Hughes adjusted his tie as he settled into the witness stand. His silver-streaked hair and pressed suit gave him an air of authority that commanded attention. Claire watched intently as Eleanor approached him, her heels clicking softly against the courtroom floor. "Mr. Hughes, could you tell us about your relationship with the victim?" Eleanor asked. "I was his financial advisor for 15 years, Robert replied, his voice clear and steady. "We worked closely together, especially in the months before his death." Eleanor nodded. "And during that time, did you notice anything unusual about the company's finances?" "Yes." Robert leaned forward slightly. "I discovered irregular transfers of large sums of money. Someone with high-level access was moving funds through various shell companies." The courtroom fell silent. Claire could feel her heart pounding as she watched the jury lean forward, hanging on every word. "When did the victim become aware of these discrepancies?" Eleanor continued. "About 3 weeks before his death." Robert's expression darkened. "He was furious when I showed him the evidence. He told me he knew exactly who was responsible and planned to confront them." Claire glanced at her father, who sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Robert. The prosecution team shuffled papers nervously. "Did the victim tell you who he suspected?" Eleanor asked. "Yes." Robert's voice grew stronger. "He mentioned confronting someone who had been stealing from the company for years, someone who had access to all the accounts, someone who could manipulate the books without raising suspicion." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. The judge tapped his gavel once, restoring order. "The day before his death," Robert continued, "he called me. He was going to expose everything. He had collected proof of the embezzlement and was ready to take action." Claire watched as several jurors exchanged meaningful glances. The prosecutor's face had grown pale, and he kept glancing at his notes with increasing desperation. Eleanor produced a document. "Mr. Hughes, I'm showing you what's been marked as Defense Exhibit 47. Can you identify these financial records?" Robert examined the paper carefully. "Yes, these are the transaction records I discovered. They show a clear pattern of theft over several years." The courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. Claire felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the jury's reactions. For the first time since her father's arrest, she could see doubt clearly written on their faces. The truth was finally coming out, piece by piece, just as she had hoped. Her father's innocence was becoming clearer with each word Robert spoke. The real killer's identity was about to be revealed, and Claire could hardly contain her emotions as she realized how close they were to justice. Claire's footsteps echoed through the empty courthouse hallway as she tried to steady her breathing. The morning's testimony had left her feeling hopeful but overwhelmed. She needed these few minutes alone during the recess to clear her head and process everything that had happened. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights as she walked, her sneakers squeaking slightly with each step. Her mind wandered back to Robert Hughes's testimony, replaying the key moments that could help free her father. As she turned the corner, she stopped abruptly. A tall man in a dark suit stood at the end of the hallway, his broad shoulders filling the narrow space. Something about his presence made Claire's stomach tighten. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto her, tracking her every slight movement. Claire took an instinctive step backward, but the man moved forward with purposeful strides. His face remained expressionless, like a mask carved from stone. When he was just a few feet away, he spoke in a low, controlled voice that seemed designed to intimidate. "Claire Walker," he said, not a question but a statement. "I'm Vincent O'Donnell, a private investigator." Claire's throat felt dry, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "What do you want?" "I'm here to give you some friendly advice." His tone suggested nothing friendly at all. "Stop digging into this case. Stop trying to be the hero. You're getting involved in something much bigger than you understand." Claire's hands trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I won't stop until my father is free." Vincent's lips curved into a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You know what happened to Peter Lawson, don't you? How he just disappeared." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It would be a shame if something similar happened to a bright young girl like yourself." Despite her fear, Claire felt anger rising in her chest. "Are you threatening me?" Vincent didn't answer. He just stared at her with that knowing look, his eyes holding secrets that made Claire's skin crawl. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken warnings. When Claire didn't back down, Vincent adjusted his suit jacket and turned to leave. As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Claire pulled out her small notebook with shaking hands. She quickly wrote down every detail she could remember about Vincent O'Donnell: his height, his expensive suit, the slight accent in his voice, and most importantly, the threat he had just made. The notebook felt like a shield in her hands, transforming her fear into determination. Vincent O'Donnell had just given her something crucial, a connection to the people trying to keep her father in prison. She wrote his name in large letters, underlining it twice. Claire sat rigid in her seat, her fingers gripping the wooden bench beneath her. The courtroom's tension was palpable as Detective Marcus Grant took the stand. His weathered face bore a confident expression, but Claire noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he placed them on the witness stand. Eleanor Brooks stood, her navy suit crisp and professional. She approached Detective Grant with measured steps, her demeanor calm but determined. The detective's testimony began routinely enough, his gruff voice echoing through the hushed courtroom as he recounted the investigation that led to James's arrest. "We found substantial evidence linking Mr. Walker to the crime scene," Detective Grant stated, his chin lifted slightly. "The fingerprints, witness statements, and circumstantial evidence all pointed to his guilt." Claire's stomach churned as she watched Eleanor begin her cross-examination. The defense attorney's voice was steady and precise. "Detective Grant, could you explain why certain witness statements were excluded from your initial report?" The detective shifted in his seat. We focused on the most relevant testimonies." "Relevant to proving Mr. Walker's guilt, you mean?" Eleanor pressed, her eyes narrowing. "What about Mrs. Henderson's statement that she saw someone else leaving the victim's office that night?" Detective Grant's confidence wavered. That witness was deemed unreliable. Unreliable because her description didn't match James Walker. Eleanor's question hung in the air. Claire watched as beads of sweat formed on Detective Grant's forehead. His earlier composure cracked as Eleanor methodically dismantled his investigation. She questioned him about evidence handling procedures, missing surveillance footage, and unexplored leads. "Why wasn't the victim's financial records thoroughly examined?" Eleanor asked, holding up a document. "These records clearly show suspicious transactions in the weeks before the murder." "We had enough evidence pointing to Walker," Detective Grant stammered, his face reddening. "Enough evidence to stop looking for the truth?" Eleanor's voice carried a sharp edge. The detective's responses became increasingly defensive and contradictory. He claimed certain procedures were followed, then backtracked when Eleanor produced documentation proving otherwise. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "So, Detective Grant," Eleanor continued, "you're telling this court that you ignored multiple witness statements, failed to follow standard evidence protocols, and abandoned several promising leads, all because you decided James Walker was guilty from the start. That's not... I mean..." Detective Grant loosened his collar, his voice cracking. Claire glanced at the jury. Their expressions had changed from polite attention to obvious concern. Some were shaking their heads, while others leaned forward, hanging on every word of the cross-examination. As Detective Grant left the stand, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Claire felt a surge of hope. Eleanor had exposed the truth. The investigation had been rushed, biased, and incomplete. The jury could see it now. The weight of possibility pressed against Claire's chest, making it hard to breathe. Maybe, just maybe, this would be enough to finally free her father. The evening news casts an eerie blue glow across Claire's living room. She sits cross-legged on the floor, her heart still buoyed by the progress they'd made in court. The news anchor's serious expression fills the screen as breaking news interrupts the regular broadcast. "We're bringing you breaking news about the death of prominent businessman Richard Maxwell in a fatal car accident earlier this evening." Claire's breath catches in her throat. Richard Maxwell, the name she'd heard whispered in corridors, the powerful figure behind her father's wrongful conviction, the man they were finally closing in on. The anchor continues, describing how Maxwell's car veered off a mountain road, bursting into flames. No survivors. No chance of questioning. No confession. Claire's hands begin to shake. She grabs her phone, dialing Eleanor Brooks with trembling fingers. "Did you see the news?" she asks, her voice cracking. "I did," Eleanor replies, her tone heavy with concern. "Claire, this complicates things significantly." The next morning, Claire sits in the courtroom, watching helplessly as the judge delivers his ruling. Without Maxwell's testimony or confession, there isn't enough new evidence to overturn James's conviction. The circumstantial evidence they'd gathered isn't enough. While recent testimony has cast some doubt on aspects of the original trial, the judge declares, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "Without concrete evidence linking another individual to the crime, I have no choice but to let the original conviction stand." Claire feels the air leave her lungs. Her vision blurs as tears well up in her eyes. Eleanor places a gentle hand on her shoulder, but Claire barely feels it. All their work, all their progress, gone in an instant. She stumbles out of the courthouse, her legs weak beneath her. The stone steps where she once felt so much hope now feel cold and unforgiving. She collapses onto them, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Through her tears, she hears the prison phone line crackle to life. It's her father's weekly call. "Claire?" James's voice is soft but steady. "I heard what happened." "Dad, I'm so sorry," she chokes out. "I failed you. We were so close, and now..." "Listen to me, sweetheart," James interrupts, his voice firm but gentle. "You haven't failed anyone. You've fought harder than anyone could have expected. You haven't lost until you stop believing." Claire wipes her eyes, her father's words settling into her heart. Even through the prison phone line, his faith in her gives her strength. She takes a deep breath, feeling a tiny spark of determination flicker back to life in her chest. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead as Claire walks through the prison's security checkpoint. Her shoulders feel heavy, weighed down by the devastating news about Maxwell's death. The guard leads her through a maze of sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing against concrete walls. When she enters the visiting room, her father is already seated at one of the small tables. Despite the orange jumpsuit and the tired lines around his eyes, James Walker's face lights up with a warm smile when he sees his daughter. Claire's heart clenches at the sight of him, still managing to look hopeful, even behind bars. They sit across from each other, separated by thick glass. Claire picks up the phone with trembling hands, pressing her palm against the barrier between them. James mirrors her gesture, his hand meeting hers through the glass. "Hi, Dad," Claire says, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's my girl," James replies softly. His eyes search her face with concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Claire takes a shaky breath. "It's Maxwell. He's dead." Her voice cracks. "There was a car accident last night. He went off the road. The evidence, everything we needed from him, it's gone." She starts to explain more, but James holds up his hand, pressing it firmly against the glass. His eyes lock with hers, filled with unwavering determination. "Listen to me, Claire," he says, his voice gentle but firm through the phone. "You haven't lost. You won't lose until you stop believing." Claire feels the words hit her like an electric current, shocking her out of her despair. Her father continues, "Everything you've done, finding Peter Lawson, working with Daniel, getting Eleanor to take the case, that wasn't luck. That was you, refusing to give up." Tears well up in Claire's eyes, but for the first time in days, they aren't tears of defeat. James's faith in her, his unshakable belief that they can still win, fills her with renewed strength. "The truth is still out there," James says, his voice steady and sure. "Maxwell might be gone, but what he did, the evidence of it, that doesn't disappear with him. You taught me that, Claire. You taught me that hope isn't about waiting for things to get better. It's about believing they can be better and working to make it happen." Claire nods, wiping her eyes with her free hand. Her father's words sink in, replacing her despair with determination. The setback feels less like an ending and more like a challenge to overcome. As their visiting time draws to a close, Claire stands up, her hand still pressed against the glass. "I love you, Dad," she says into the phone. "I love you too, sweetheart," James replies. "Remember what I said. You haven't lost." Claire walks out of the prison, each step feeling lighter than the last. The afternoon sun warms her face as she emerges from the building. Her father's words echo in her mind, giving her the strength to keep fighting. She wipes away the last of her tears and straightens her shoulders, ready to continue their battle for justice. The desk lamp casts a soft glow across Claire's bedroom as she sits cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by case files she's memorized by heart. Her eyes scan the familiar pages, but tonight something nags at her consciousness, a half-remembered conversation that feels more important with each passing moment. She closes her eyes, remembering Lydia's hushed phone conversation weeks ago. The words come back clearly now. The witness who vanished. If he talks, everything could be ruined. At the time, Claire had been focused on Peter Lawson, but what if there was another witness? Someone else who knew the truth. Claire glances at her bedroom door, listening for any sound of movement in the house. Lydia's gentle snoring drifts from down the hall. Taking a deep breath, Claire slides off her bed and creeps toward Lydia's home office. The door creaks slightly as she pushes it open. Moonlight streams through the window, illuminating the neat desk and filing cabinets. Claire's heart pounds as she searches through drawers and folders, careful to keep everything in its original place. Then she spots it, a small safe tucked behind a painting on the wall. Claire's hands tremble as she remembers the combination she once saw Lydia use. Her mother's birthday. With shaking fingers, she dials the numbers. The safe opens with a soft click. Inside, Claire finds a stack of documents, yellowed with age, but carefully preserved. Her breath catches as she reads the first page, a letter detailing a substantial payment to Lydia in exchange for her silence about James's case. There are bank statements showing regular deposits from an offshore account and handwritten notes describing meetings with the real murderer's associates. But what makes Claire's blood run cold is a signed statement from Lydia herself, admitting she knew about evidence that would have cleared James. She had deliberately hidden it, accepting money to keep quiet, while her brother-in-law went to prison. Claire's hands shake as she holds the damning evidence. All this time, Lydia had known the truth. She had watched Claire struggle, had seen her fight to prove her father's innocence, and had said nothing. Without hesitation, Claire gathers the documents, careful not to disturb anything else in the safe. She tucks them into her jacket and closes the safe door, replacing the painting exactly as she found it. Her heart thunders in her chest as she slips out of the office. These papers could change everything. They prove not just her father's innocence, but the deliberate conspiracy to keep him imprisoned. Claire grabs her backpack from her room, stuffing the documents inside. She can't stay here another minute, not with the weight of this discovery pressing down on her. With one last look around her room, she heads for the front door. The night air hits her face as she steps outside, and Claire starts running. She doesn't look back at the house where her aunt's betrayal had lived for so long. The truth is finally in her hands, and she won't let anything stop her from using it to free her father. The hallway creaks under Claire's feet as she enters the dimly lit house. Her heart pounds against her ribs, the stolen documents feeling heavy in her trembling hands. Through the window, she watches the neighbors' lights flicker out one by one until the street falls quiet. Only then does she make her move. Claire finds Aunt Lydia in her office, surrounded by the familiar scent of coffee and old books. The older woman looks up, her reading glasses perched on her nose, expression shifting from surprise to concern at Claire's late arrival. "I know what you did," Claire says, her voice steadier than she expected. She holds up the papers from the safe, watching as recognition floods Lydia's face. The color drains from her aunt's cheeks, and her hands begin to shake so badly she has to set down her coffee cup. "Where did you?" Lydia's voice trails off as she stands, her legs unsteady. Her eyes dart between Claire and the documents, wide with fear. "The safe," Claire answers simply. "I found everything. The money transfers, the letters, all of it. You helped them frame my dad." Lydia collapses back into her chair, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her secrets. Claire quietly pulls out her phone, pressing record as tears begin streaming down her aunt's face. "I was scared," Lydia whispers, her voice breaking. "They came to me right after it happened. Said they knew things about me, about my past. They offered money, but the threats were what really made me do it." She wipes at her eyes with trembling hands. "They said they'd destroy me if I didn't help them." "So you let them destroy my father instead?" Claire's voice cracks with emotion. "I never meant for it to go this far," Lydia sobs, her carefully maintained composure crumbling completely. "They just wanted me to keep quiet at first, but then they needed more. They made me hide evidence, lie to investigators." Her words tumble out faster now, like a dam breaking. "Every time I thought about coming forward, I remembered what they said they'd do to me. I was a coward, Claire. I'm so sorry." Claire stands silent, phone still recording as her aunt's confession pours out. Every detail, every name, every piece of the conspiracy that stole her father's freedom, it's all being captured. "They're powerful people, Claire," Lydia warns through her tears. "They'll come after you too." "I'm not afraid," Claire responds, her voice firm. "Not anymore." With the confession secured, Claire turns and runs from the house, leaving her aunt crying in the darkness. The night air feels electric against her skin as she clutches her phone, knowing it contains the key to her father's freedom. Her feet carry her swiftly toward the courthouse, each step bringing her closer to justice. Claire's feet pound against the cold pavement as she races through the darkened streets. Her breath comes in short gasps, creating small clouds in the chilly night air. The phone in her hand feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds, not because of its physical weight, but because of the precious confession it contains. Her aunt's tearful voice, admitting to years of deception, could finally set her father free. "Almost there," Claire whispers to herself between breaths, her eyes fixed on the courthouse's illuminated facade ahead. The building's stone columns loom larger with each step, and Claire's heart hammers against her ribs. She clutches the phone tighter, protecting it like the treasure it is. The courthouse lobby bustles with late-night activity. Lawyers in suits shuffle papers, clerks hurry between offices, and the echo of voices bounces off the marble walls. Claire's sneakers squeak against the polished floor as she scans the crowd, searching for Eleanor's familiar face. There, by the water fountain, Eleanor Brooks stands tall in her navy suit, speaking with 3 reporters who scribble furiously in their notepads. Claire doesn't hesitate. She pushes through the crowd, ignoring the annoyed looks from those she bumps into. "Ms. Brooks!" Claire calls out, her voice cracking with urgency. "Ms. Brooks, please, you need to hear this." Eleanor turns, her eyebrows rising at Claire's disheveled appearance. "Claire, what are you doing here so late?" "I have it," Claire pants, holding out her phone with shaking hands. "The proof we need. It's Aunt Lydia. She confessed to everything." Eleanor excuses herself from the reporters and takes the phone. She presses play, and Lydia's trembling voice fills the space between them. Claire watches Eleanor's face transform as she listens, from skepticism to shock to determination. "This changes everything," Eleanor breathes, already turning toward the courtroom doors. Her heels click rapidly against the floor as she strides forward, purpose in every step. "Wait here, Claire." Claire stands rooted to the spot, watching Eleanor's figure disappear through the heavy wooden doors. Her heart still races, but now it's with hope rather than exertion. Inside that phone is the truth they've been fighting for all along, the key to her father's freedom. The courtroom doors swing shut with a heavy thud, and Claire takes her first real breath since leaving Lydia's house. She leans against the cool marble wall, closing her eyes for just a moment. They're finally going to hear the truth. The courtroom feels like it's holding its breath as Claire sits rigid in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The wooden bench beneath her feels hard and unyielding, but she barely notices. Her entire focus is on Judge Reynolds as he listens to the recording of Lydia's confession playing through the courtroom speakers. Aunt Lydia's trembling voice fills the space. "I was paid to keep quiet, to help cover up what really happened." The words echo off the high ceiling, and Claire watches the judge's expression change. His stern facade cracks slightly as the gravity of the confession sinks in. Eleanor Brooks stands confidently beside the evidence table, her shoulders squared and her gaze steady. She's fought this battle alongside Claire, and now their moment of truth has arrived. The jury members lean forward in their seats, their faces showing dawning comprehension as the full extent of the cover-up becomes clear. Claire steals a glance at her father. James sits at the defense table, his hands folded calmly, but she can see the slight tremor in his shoulders. He's been waiting for this moment for so long. They both have. After the recording ends, silence descends on the courtroom. Judge Reynolds removes his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he considers the evidence. The tension builds with each passing second until Claire feels like she might burst. Finally, Judge Reynolds clears his throat and speaks, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "The court acknowledges the gravity of this new evidence," he announces, each word measured and deliberate. Based on this confession, the conviction of James Walker is overturned. The case will be reviewed, and a retrial will be scheduled immediately. For a moment, Claire can't breathe. The words seem to hover in the air, too wonderful to be real. Then the reality crashes over her like a wave. They've done it. They've actually done it. Her father's conviction has been overturned. The courtroom erupts in applause, the sound thunderous in the enclosed space. People are standing, voices raised in celebration, but Claire barely notices them. Her eyes are fixed on her father, watching as tears begin to stream down his face. James is led from the holding cell, and their eyes meet across the courtroom. His smile, that warm, gentle smile she's missed so much, breaks through his tears. Claire stands on shaking legs, ready to run to him. After all these months of fighting, of refusing to give up hope, of believing in the truth when everyone else had given up, Her father is finally coming home. The Walker family home feels different today. Warmer, brighter somehow. Sunlight streams through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that Claire has kept polished all these months. The familiar creak of the front door sounds like music as James steps through it, wearing his old blue sweater and khaki pants that hang a bit loose on his thinner frame. Claire can't contain herself. She rushes forward, throwing her arms around her father's waist with such force that he stumbles back a step. James catches his balance and lifts her up, holding her close against his chest. His arms are strong and secure around her, just like she remembers. "I'm home, sweetheart," he whispers, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm really home." The tears flow freely between them, neither trying to hide them. Claire buries her face in her father's sweater, breathing in the familiar scent she's missed so desperately. As evening settles in, they move to the kitchen. James pauses in the doorway, taking in the sight of their old dinner table with 2 plates set out. Such a simple thing, but his eyes well up again. Claire watches as he runs his hand along the smooth wooden surface before sitting down. "I can't believe I'm actually sitting here," James says softly, looking around the kitchen with wonder. The smell of home-cooked food, the sound of the old refrigerator humming. "I've dreamed about these things every night." They share a meal of James's favorite dishes. Claire spent all morning cooking them with careful attention to detail. The conversation flows naturally between them, punctuated by occasional comfortable silences as they simply enjoy being together again. Later, they settle onto the living room couch. James sinks into the familiar cushions, closing his eyes for a moment to savor the feeling. Claire curls up next to him, just like she used to do when she was younger. "Tell me about everything I missed," James says, his arm around Claire's shoulders. "I want to hear it all." They talk for hours, about Claire's school, about the friends who stood by them, about the small moments that made up the years they lost. The pain is there in their words, but it's softened now by the joy of reunion. James touches the family photos on the wall, studies the changes in Claire's face that happened while he was away. "You've grown so much," he says quietly. "I'm sorry I missed it." "But you're here now," Claire responds, her voice firm. "That's what matters." They end up back at the kitchen table, where it all began that terrible night so long ago. But this time, there's no fear, no uncertainty. James reaches across the table and takes Claire's hand. "You did this, Claire," he says, his eyes filled with gratitude and pride. "You never gave up on me." Claire smiles, squeezing his hand. "I knew you'd come home, Dad. I always knew." James sits in his old bedroom, the morning light casting soft shadows across the familiar walls. His fingers trace the edges of a worn photograph. Claire at age 6, her smile missing 2 front teeth, her pigtails slightly crooked. The image feels both close and impossibly distant, like reaching through time itself. More photos line his dresser. Claire's first day of school, her winning science fair project, countless birthday celebrations he'd missed. Each image tells a story of moments lost, years that slipped away while he sat in a cold cell. The room still holds his belongings, preserved exactly as he left them. But everything feels different now. Even the air smells strange, too clean, too quiet compared to the harsh metallic scents and constant noise of prison. His hand shakes slightly as he picks up another photo. The world beyond these walls has changed so much. New buildings have sprung up in their neighborhood. Old stores have closed, and even the familiar rhythm of daily life feels foreign to him now. The simple act of choosing what clothes to wear or when to eat still overwhelms him. The soft creak of floorboards announces Claire's arrival before she appears in the doorway, carrying a plate stacked with golden pancakes. Steam rises from them, carrying the sweet scent of maple syrup through the room. She walks carefully, balancing the plate as she makes her way to his bed. "I made your favorite," she says softly, sitting beside him. With extra chocolate chips, just like before. James manages a small smile, though his heart aches at the effort she's making. The nightmares from last night still linger. The sound of cell doors slamming, guards shouting, the endless echo of footsteps on concrete. Sometimes he wakes up thinking he's still there, his body tensed for the morning count. Claire notices his distant look and places her hand on his arm. "You're safe now, Dad," she says, her voice steady and sure. "You're home." James takes a deep breath, letting her words wash over him. The warmth of her presence beside him feels like an anchor, keeping him grounded in this moment. He looks down at the plate of pancakes, perfectly made, just like they used to share on Sunday mornings. Then he looks back at his daughter, seeing the strength and love in her eyes. For the first time since walking through his front door, he feels something shift inside him, a tiny spark of hope. The road ahead won't be easy, but with Claire beside him, he knows he can face it. The healing will take time, but he's ready to try. Claire squeezes his hand gently, sitting close beside him as they talk. "You're home now, Dad," she repeats softly. "You're safe." James feels a tear slip down his cheek as he squeezes her hand in return. "Thank you for bringing me back," he whispers, his voice thick with emotion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison parking lot as James and Claire pulled up to the familiar gates. James's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The concrete walls loomed before them, but this time, James wasn't wearing handcuffs or an orange jumpsuit. He was wearing his own clothes, sitting next to his daughter, free to leave whenever he wanted. "Are you okay, Dad?" Claire asked softly, noticing the tension in his jaw. James nodded slowly. "Just strange being back here. Different perspective now." They walked through security, the metal detector beeping as they passed through. The guard recognized James, giving him a respectful nod. The visiting room looked exactly as James remembered it. Stark white walls, hard plastic chairs, the constant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Luis was already waiting when they entered. His face lit up at the sight of James, and they embraced like brothers. "Man, it's good to see you on this side of the glass," Luis said, his voice thick with emotion. They sat at one of the small tables, Luis leaning forward earnestly. "I've been following your case, James. What your daughter did. It's giving hope to so many of us in here." Claire watched as her father listened to Luis describe other cases. Men who claimed innocence, evidence that didn't add up, trials that seemed rushed or unfair. Luis's eyes burned with passion as he spoke about each case. "We need your help, James," Luis said finally. "Your story. It proves the system can be wrong. It proves things can change. There are others in here just like you, men who deserve a second look at their cases." James sat quietly for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Claire could see something shifting in his eyes, a purpose taking shape, replacing the lost look he'd carried since coming home. "Tell me more about these cases," James said, pulling out a small notebook. As Luis spoke, James took careful notes, asking detailed questions. Claire watched her father transform before her eyes, from a man still processing his freedom to someone ready to fight for others. When their visiting time was almost up, Luis gripped James's hand tightly. "You made it out, brother. Don't forget about us still in here." As they walked back to their car, James stopped and turned to look at the prison building. "I can't just walk away from all of this," he said to Claire. "I have to do something. I can't forget the others who are still there." Claire nodded, understanding that this was just the beginning of a new chapter. Together, they were going to make sure justice didn't stop with them. Claire sat at her father's old mahogany desk, the surface covered with dozens of opened envelopes and handwritten letters. The afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up another letter, this one from a mother whose son had been in prison for 15 years for a crime she swore he didn't commit. "Please," the letter read, "you gave us hope when you freed your father. Can you help us too?" The weight of these pleas pressed down on Claire's chest. Each envelope contained a story of pain, of families torn apart, of justice denied. Some letters came from small towns she'd never heard of, others from big cities across the country. Journalists wrote asking for interviews, wanting to share her story of determination. Activists reached out, praising her courage and asking her to join their cause. Claire picked up another letter, her heart aching as she read about a daughter, not much different from herself, fighting for her mother's freedom. The familiar feeling of helplessness washed over her, but this time it was different. Now she knew what it took to fight the system and win. James appeared in the doorway, his quiet footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. He noticed Claire's furrowed brow and the slight tremble in her hands as she held the letters. Moving to her side, he picked up one of the unopened envelopes and began to read. "You have a voice now, Claire," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "People are listening. They see what you did, how you never gave up. They need someone who understands their fight." Claire looked up at her father, seeing the pride and encouragement in his eyes. The same determination that had driven her to free him began to stir again in her heart. She reached for a clean sheet of paper and her favorite pen. "Dear Mrs. Thompson," she began writing, her hand steady now. "I received your letter about your son, Michael. I want you to know that you're not alone in this fight." The words flowed easily as Claire shared her own story, offering hope and practical advice about gathering evidence and finding the right people to help. She knew this letter was just the beginning, but it felt right. This wasn't just about her father anymore. It was about all the other families still waiting for justice. James watched his daughter write, remembering the little girl who had refused to give up on him. Now she was becoming something more. A voice for those who needed one, a fighter for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Claire finished the letter and looked up at her father. "This is just the beginning, Dad," she said with a determined smile. James nodded, recognizing the familiar spark in his daughter's eyes, the same spark that had brought him home. The polished wooden conference table gleamed under the soft lighting of the law office. Claire sat next to her father, her notebook open and ready. The room felt different from the cold courthouse where they had fought their own battle. This time, they were here to help others. 3 lawyers sat across from them. Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s. Michael Torres, who had 20 years of experience with wrongful convictions. And David Reed, a younger attorney known for his innovative approach to difficult cases. "Your story has captured public attention," Sarah said, spreading out several case files. "We can use that momentum to help others who are still fighting for justice." James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. The prison pallor had faded from his face, but his eyes still carried the weight of his experience. "How many cases are we looking at?" "We've identified 15 potential wrongful convictions that need immediate attention," Michael explained, his voice steady and professional. "Each one shows similar patterns to your case: rushed investigations, suppressed evidence, witnesses who were pressured to change their stories." Claire's pen moved quickly across her notebook as she took everything in. The familiar determination that had driven her to free her father sparked again in her chest. "Tell us about your experience," David asked James gently. "It could help us understand what these other prisoners are going through." James took a deep breath, his hands tightening slightly. "Every day in prison feels like you're drowning," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "You know you're innocent, but nobody believes you. The system that's supposed to protect you becomes a wall you can't break through." Claire reached for her father's hand as he continued sharing his story. She watched the lawyers taking notes, seeing the same fire for justice in their eyes that she felt in her heart. "We want to speak publicly," Claire announced, her voice steady and clear. "People need to know this isn't just about my dad. There are others out there. Families torn apart. Innocent people behind bars. Sarah nodded approvingly. Your voice carries weight now, Claire. People will listen. We can arrange speaking engagements, interviews, meetings with advocacy groups. It won't be easy, Michael warned, his expression serious. The system doesn't like to admit its mistakes. You'll face resistance, maybe even threats. We're not afraid, James said, squeezing Claire's hand. We've already faced the worst they could throw at us. The lawyers began outlining their strategy, which cases to prioritize, how to approach the media, what resources they could offer. Claire wrote everything down, her determination growing with each passing minute. As the meeting drew to a close, Claire and James stood up, ready to begin their new mission. Claire's heart felt full, not just with hope, but with purpose. They were no longer just survivors of injustice. They were becoming warriors against it. Walking toward the office door, Claire's hand found her father's. We're not stopping here, she said, her voice filled with conviction. James looked at his daughter, pride shining in his eyes. No, we're not. The morning dew sparkled on the grass as Claire and James sat together on the weathered park bench. The sunrise painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges, casting long shadows across the empty playground. Claire's notebook lay open in her lap, filled with names and case numbers, evidence of her tireless work over the past year. James wrapped an arm around his daughter's shoulders, taking in the peaceful moment. At 13, Claire carried herself with a quiet confidence that made his heart swell with pride. The determined little girl who had fought so hard for his freedom had grown into something remarkable. Remember when we used to do math homework together? Claire asked softly, leaning against her father's shoulder. Before everything happened. James nodded, his eyes growing distant for a moment. Those were good times, simple times. We lost so much, Claire said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. All those years you were gone, but look at everything we've gained too. She opened her notebook, showing James the latest case she'd been researching. Another wrongfully convicted person fighting for justice. Maria's case is looking promising. The lawyers think we might be able to get her a retrial soon. James listened intently as Claire detailed her work, her voice animated as she explained the evidence she'd helped uncover. This was no longer just about their story. It had become something bigger, a mission they shared. You know what amazes me most, James said, watching his daughter's face light up as she spoke. How you've taken all that pain and turned it into something beautiful. You're helping people find hope when they need it most. Claire closed her notebook, looking up at the brightening sky. I couldn't have done any of it without you, Dad. Even when you were gone, knowing you were innocent gave me strength. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of a new day. Other early risers had started appearing in the park, joggers, dog walkers, people beginning their daily routines. You were never really gone, Dad, Claire said softly, reaching for his hand. I always knew you'd come home. James squeezed her hand gently, his heart full of love and gratitude for the remarkable young woman his daughter had become. The sunrise painted their faces in golden light as they sat together, father and daughter, survivors and warriors for justice. If you enjoyed the story of Claire, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this. If you enjoyed the story of Claire, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.